Morning, everyone, and it's really very good to be here. And I must echo your point about that partnership over the years, working together on many things, including the behaviours framework, professional development, and so on, working on professional careers together. It's been a very productive relationship. One reason I think for the success of the Leadership Foundation is that we have made the right kind of relationships with professional partners in the sector. I want to speak about three things. Essentially what I'm calling the psychological contract, and that is, first of all, well, has that psychological contract, is it changing in the sector? Secondly, what does this mean for leadership challenges? And thirdly, and I regret this, when I was asked months ago if I would speak, I said I'll end up with 10 tips. So I'm committing myself to 10 things that we might do together. So I'll make sure I get that all in time and provide you with some time for questions. I will also end up on the subject of magic, and I will come back to that in a moment. I want to start, first of all, with encouraging you to read a book. I reckon no one has read this. Maybe you have. It's only been out for a few weeks. It's Gary Hamel, the leadership guru's latest book, What Matters Now. It's essentially focused on the private sector. It's very much post-credit crunch, post-banking crisis. Where are we going in leadership? But the most interesting thing about that, if you look at that quote there, and I won't read it all out, but essentially what's saying is that we need to think again in the private sector about values. And when you get into the detail of this book, what it's actually saying, in a certain way, the private sector needs to start becoming like universities. Now, not too much like universities, but things like it's indicating and illustrating the importance of self-leadership. I'll come back to that later. Collegiality. The best companies, the best innovative companies use collegiality to the best effect. Innovation, collaborative innovation, values-based leadership. Often we're put into victim mode as a sector, that somehow the private sector's got it right and we've got to learn from them. The private sector has got a lot to learn from us. Second thing is, anyone who went to my session a year ago, which was a smaller session, knows that I spoke about extreme sports. This was a strange topic at the AUA conference, but it was about risk. What I discovered mostly, I'm not going to talk about extreme sports today, it's just to reflect. I was amazed at the percentage of people in an AUA audience who participated in extreme sports. All I'm saying to you is, if you're still here, jumping off buildings, climbing rock faces, keep it up, because it's very good for the image of the AUA. What you will know statistically is that you're more likely to stay alive than if you cycle, which was actually the essence of the speech. My image this year is a different one. It's the Tempest. And you might say, why? Well, first of all, if you don't know, and none of you will have got tickets, but the opening 4.5-hour ceremony of the Olympics features Shakespeare's The Tempest. So your theme for this year is ships, shipwrecks, tempests. But you might say, why the Tempest? Well, actually, it could be that I'm going to talk about a perfect storm facing the sector, and in many cases there is an extraordinary combination of events coming together in the sector, wherever you are in the UK. And of course, the interesting thing is the agenda is different in different parts of the UK. Or am I talking about shipwrecked universities? I hope none of you will be, though it will be a world of winners and losers. But actually, I'm not choosing the Tempest for either of those reasons. The chief character of the Tempest is Prospero, a rather strange and eccentric leader who indulges in magic. And I'll come back to magic later, as I said, magic and leadership. I'm going to give you a test as well. The importance of leadership and sailing. This will show a picture of a storm-hit modern sailing boat, ice skipper boats. And I think that we have a lot to learn from good skippering, in a sense. If I'm with a group of people who don't know much about sailing, and I'm sailing from here to the other side of the room, anyone here who does sailing knows I won't go in a straight line. I will get there with the wind and the tide, the weather, British waters as they are. There'll be a whole sets of movements we will jibe and tack and so on. This is the boat. This is not my boat. I can't afford a boat that big. But I don't sit at the wheel. Someone else is at the wheel. What I'm doing is providing a narrative to that crew and reassuring the ones that don't know why we're going in the opposite direction. And any of you in your universities occasionally go in the opposite direction that you expect to be going? I'm sure you do. What you need is leaders who will give you advice, support, confidence, a story of where, because the most important single thing you're taught when you're taught sailing is work out your point of sail, which is up there, and never forget it. And in a sense, leadership is about the narrative as to how we get there. And I was very interested, and I saw Alison Johns. Alison, thank you very much for helping with the slides. I only told you last night, but your ultimate boss is the Times Higher last week, and it was a picture of a boat. So clearly the image for anyone making speeches this year is boats, all right? And this is a boat, storm-tossed seas, with Hefke on the sails. And it's an article by Andy Westwood saluting Sir Alan Langlands, chief executive of Hefke, about the way he's guiding the sector in England through this period. And he's doing exactly that. I hope this will go, Alison, on the walls of Hefke's office in both Centrepoint and Bristol. The idea that Hefke's sails will see us through is extraordinary. So the psychological contract, what am I talking about? I mean, I'm not an academic, but I have done research in this, working with Professor David Guest at King's College, London. And in a sense, the psychological contract, say applied to an organisation, is the deal. It's that set of reciprocal expectations that all come together. They're about a sense of fairness, dignity, the collegial versus the corporate. It's about people's perspectives and perceptions of top leadership and so on. It's something which should be planned as far as possible, not erratic or accidental. And that's what I'm talking about. And I think the basic psychological contract between universities, staff, students, government, key stakeholders is on the move. And that's becoming a little less easy to control. Another book that is quoted a lot at the moment, Stefan Collini's What Are Universities For? It's worth looking at, or at least Googling and seeing the key quotes from it. Two quotes from that. I mean, this is someone who is writing from the inside as an academic, as a very distinguished academic, desperately worried about what's happening to the sector as it's being led into kind of business-led processes. He says, university is perhaps the single most important institutional medium for conserving, understanding, extending, and handing on to subsequent generations the intellectual, scientific, and artistic heritage of mankind. We are merely custodians for the present generation of a complex intellectual inheritance which we did not create and which is not ours to destroy. This is a very protectionist view of higher education, I think. I was speaking at the Finance Directors Group conference on Monday against that background, looking at the implementation of the UK Review on Efficiencies. That's a hard quote to deal with. That is saying we must not destroy the infrastructure, fabric, etc. of this sector. There's no right answer to this, but interesting, another quote. A lot of people are becoming rather critical in the press, the Daily Mail and so on. He expresses concerns about an implication in the comments of some journalists and politicians that many academics are little better than middle-class welfare scroungers indulging their hobbies at public expense. And the trouble is, there are one or two journalists and a few politicians who believe that. And a year ago, I was at the Hefke annual conference in Aston and heard the most depressing speech ever from a Secretary of State. I expect to see in a university sector faced with the onset of more competition and more demanding students, a ferment of creative thinking on how to redesign course structures and manage major change amongst staff so as to promote higher quality but lower cost teaching. I may be missing something, but I haven't seen much evidence of this. I think the government's view has changed, but I think we have got to change it further. I think public opinion thinks we haven't got it in terms of bringing universities up to date. And there's a wish amongst politicians that that psychological contract should change. So what are the elements of this psychological contract? I think they are, I mean, there's no right answer to these. They all begin with C, but they're about, are we now saying the student is a customer? Of course we are, but actually the student is a co-creator. But I also like the thing that came from Matthew Taylor, who was addressing the conference we run collectively with Hefke in January. Matthew Taylor is the chief executive of the RSA. Do read his work. Very interesting. He's the son of Laurie Taylor, and he's not a comedian. He said, yes, they're customers, yes, they're co-creators, but they're also citizens. And there is an issue about citizenship. And in going back to Gary Hamel's book about companies, he's into citizenship too. So it is changing, moving from comprehensive to differentiated universities. The fundamental change that's happening in so many universities, as you will know, of reducing the number of courses, obviously of redundancy, but obviously also of clarity by reducing the range of options on offer. That is happening. Then the issue about, is it actually a movement from being a collaborative sector to a competitive one? We clearly have that journey. Also, and we discuss this on our top management program, we have a part dealing with this, which is the program we run for people who are kind of one step away from vice chancellors. We try and help them understand the skills for moving from where we had an HE sector, a comfortable sector, to a higher education system with new players, probably new international players, new private players, etc. That is happening too. Trusted to challenged. I mentioned that we are less trusted, I think, by politicians and by the press than we were, say, 10 years ago, not long before I started this organization. And we're certainly moving from certainty to uncertainty. So, coming to one of the sort of key messages of my presentation to you, what do I think are the critical leadership issues and, in a sense, competences and capabilities that are needed for this world? And I would say, first and foremost, the ability to handle uncertainty and ambiguity. And I think a lot of people in the sector are still not quite there on that. They think it will go away. About challenging inefficiency and challenging the reluctance to innovate. Yes, about being entrepreneurial. The ability not just to initiate change, but to make it happen. The ability to see change through. We're a fantastic sector at creating a rhetoric for change. We're not so good at following it right through. We do have to work out how to collaborate still as a sector and compete. And that combination of those two will be critical to success. We have to work even harder at engagement, and that's all manner of meanings of engagement. Employee engagement at one end of the scale, and really high quality engagement with stakeholders in our communities and so on. We have to think about that concept of citizenship, which I think starts to unlock the issue about the culture of universities in this competitive world, i.e. not just focusing on customers, not just focusing on co-creators. I think it brings the two together. And having said all that, being true to the core values of higher education. I learned when I started this job 9 years ago that the Leadership Foundation was not to be a vehicle for promoting managerialism. We would fail. The sector would not appreciate it. There are people around who think it's going to go away. And that's a very unfair comment on Sir Peter Scott, who we work very closely with. But Peter Scott has brilliantly facilitated, he was the Vice-Chancellor of Kingston University, he's now at Institute of Education, writes regularly for The Guardian. We've done a number of round tables about the future, working with senior leaders. And if you take a very long view of this sector, it hasn't changed very much. He would say, although there have been a few mergers, there's still the same number of institutions as they were 50 years ago. They're just in different forms and different types and so on. And he has that quote, all change is to ensure that we stay the same. I have put a question mark after it. I do think we're in a period of disruptive innovation. There is a book, and I can't remember the author's surname. He's from Harvard. Someone will know it. Alistair will know it. Christensen, forget his first name. And he's written a very good book recently on disruptive innovation, and particularly in universities. And I believe we are experiencing some disruptive innovation, as opposed to sustaining innovation where it is incremental. And I think certainly new market mechanisms, whether they be contrived, as they largely are, or real, as they will be internationally, the effect of research and impact, and a concept which I think is going to be interesting to watch as to whether it happens is unbundling. And that is the sense that, in fact, one of the finance directors on Monday said one of the problems with this sector that makes it so resistant to change is that we are too vertically integrated, i.e. it all kind of hangs together. Now that may be a huge advantage. On the other hand, I think what you are seeing signs of with private players, you're not going to see hundreds of new private universities coming in, but you're going to see private players who are, through outsourcing and other collaborative arrangements, disaggregating some of the things that we do. And I think that process of disaggregation or unbundling will come further. I used to work in television in this city. I was HR director for Granada right through the 80s and the early 90s. And that was the period when broadcasting, mainly ITV at that stage, but then the BBC did the same, started to disaggregate. Independent production companies, independent facilities companies. And there was one ITV company, Carlton, who looked carefully at what you didn't need or what you couldn't outsource. And they came to the view you could outsource almost anything. And interestingly, if you look at broadcasting, what broadcasting has done, BBC and ITV, has largely outsourced their core business, which is making programs. When you watch plays, films, documentaries, you will normally end saying this is a hat-trick production, this is an ABC production. And that is an interesting thought. I mean, Carlton said they could outsource everything except one department. And it wasn't finance, and it wasn't programs. Anyone know what it might be? You have to shout out. HR? No, sorry. I know, it was public relations. And you think of the governments wrestling with that at the moment. You know, the one thing you've got to keep control on is your image. Now, they never did outsource everything. But there is an interesting issue about this disaggregation of universities, and we may see that happen internationally, and obviously issues of open educational resources. All I'm saying is I think we are moving into a period of disruptive innovation, which leads me, I'm going quite quickly actually, this is quite good, I thought I would take longer to get to here. I am going to work through those 10, I promised you 10 things, and I'm going to go through them, not in any great detail, but in the sense of saying, against that background of a premise that you may wish to challenge in the questions, that the psychological contract is changing, that we are going through a period of, to a degree, disruptive innovation, what are the 10 key issues of a leadership and management nature? The first one starts with the student. And I am advising you to read one or two things. Nothing I'm advising you to read is either too long or unreadable. I'd like you to read, it's on our website, Leadership Foundation website, we're doing under our research series some short stimulus papers. This is called Developing the Whole Student, Leading Higher Education Initiatives that Integrate Mind and Heart. It's by Kathleen Quinlan of Oxford. And this is the first time I've really seen a coherent analysis which starts with the holistic student experience and then identifies what leaders need to do to play to and support that whole experience. I haven't got time to go into all the, all the detail, but what it does is it identifies those 3 zones on those outer circles. One which is about creating the organizational conditions for that. The second is about actually the leadership of learning itself, and I'm very pleased that we are doing 2 new collaborative programs with the Higher Education Academy on the leading of teaching. And then there's about behaviors, the modeling of those values as a leader in a way that supports the student experience as a whole. And we have created a network called Leading the Student Experience, which brings together professional bodies like Amoshi, and there'll be members here, I suspect, Amoshi, USISA, Sconal, ARC. And I think that whole issue of starting from the whole student experience and then looking at these is really important. The second issue is about public and societal engagement. I think that despite the fact that the sector is becoming more globalized, internationalization is on everyone's agenda, one of the key sheet anchors about being an effective university, whether you're at the top of the Russell Group or whatever, wherever you are in the spectrum, is about engagement, public engagement. So increasing that integration of institutional interest with the wider public good, placing universities at the heart of social and economic advancement, is a quote from, again, you can Google this on the UUK website, a very good short report from Universities UK, their long-term strategy network. And that their conclusion, looking at scenarios, is that is an absolutely vital area. So working with communities, working with your city, working with your sub-region, etc. So that's a second, in a sense, I suppose you might say, these are some of the sort of lifelines for survival. The third, I thought, was an unmemorable mnemonic. I did some work a while ago, working with Hefke, on distinctiveness. We took there'll be people from this group here. It was working for the 14 institutions of the Cathedrals Group. They are the institutions that have some kind of link back historically with the Church of England, Catholic Church, etc. And we looked at what made them distinctive, but our end game was to identify what seemed to be the components of distinctiveness. And we came up with ultimately 5 core points, and I've mentioned at least one of them, 2 of them really already. Distinctiveness starts with that narrative. Remember me sailing on that boat? The narrative, the clear storyline, which may be changing for some universities, but getting that narrative right. I've dropped vision, by the way. Vision and mission, well, visions. We, on the top management program, we have about 21 very senior leaders on that. And just before the first day of the program, we collect from their institutions their vision statements. And then we present to these 21 people on day one, 21 vision statements, and ask them to identify their own. The hit rate's about 50%, which is quite good, really. I'm not so keen on vision. I like narrative, story. This is the story of our institution. Secondly, place. I've mentioned that already. A sense of place was critical in distinctiveness, engaging with stakeholders and so on. Thirdly, values. Those values being not just on bits of paper, but acted out. Think of the model of Kathleen Quinlan's thing about behaving, living the model, the behavior of the values of the institution. Community, and we've talked about citizen in a number of different ways. A sense both of universities being communities, they're ultimately not PLCs, they are communities that have to operate in a very business-like way, and using that as a guide. And finally, clusters. I can't predict the future here, but I think that there will be different clusters. We've done another stimulus paper about to be published using the Delphi technique of getting a lot of people who are knowledgeable of an issue to look to the future. And this is called 2025. And interestingly, they predict the size of the sector will not be very different. Might be a few new international players, but they predict quite different clusters, different mission groups. And I think distinctiveness will not just come from, I mean, there are 160 universities. We're not going to have 160 different distinctive universities, but we might have a number of very distinctive clusters. And the route to the future may be about working out nationally or regionally or internationally the clusters that are distinctive, the collaborations. And then at this event, where I spoke to this, which was again this conference we do jointly with HEFGE in January, I said there will be a bottle of champagne for anyone who can turn this mnemonic into something meaningful. And you know, a member of the audience from Matthews University, from Oxford Brookes, who's running their Distinct project, Anna Myers, came up and she said, right there's one other thing that's vital, and it's called needs positive vice-chancellor commitment. And she was right. And she's got the bottle of champagne. So I can't give you the opportunity. I think that was a really good answer. The fourth thing is very interesting indeed, and that is about learning from academic leadership. We have just, as you see it on our website, just published a really important piece of research on academic leadership. We've done a lot of work on professional leadership. And what that tells you is that academics don't see academic leaders as leaders. We kind of know this. They, when asked to talk about who their leaders are, they talk about colleagues, peers, people in other universities. They will have a formal leader. But they, in a sense, are saying academic leadership is an oxymoron. And the sort of behaviors they're talking about that work are winning hearts and minds, nurturing the next generation, creating that space to thrive, stimulating a culture of debate and inquiry, fostering a sense of community, encouraging curiosity. And it's a wake-up call to us at the Leadership Foundation. We do a lot of leadership programs. The majority of people on our programs are academic leaders. And we must always be careful not to fall into the traditional approaches to leadership and simply import from the private sector or other parts of the public sector. What this is telling us is that we have to be we have to listen to what academics are saying. Even if we don't like what we hear, sometimes we have to listen. And there's an interesting quote about who academics lead from. And this is unfair because it's a bit at the extreme end, and I can just about read it in this light here. People were asked, who provides you with leadership in terms of your academic work? The answer from this senior lecturer, female senior lecturer, was people I've never met. mostly. Some of them are dead. And my superior of my doctorate degree as well. As a more mature academic, I've enjoyed working with collaborators, but that's not leadership. I really dislike this concept of leadership because once you're grown up, you don't want to be led. You want to work as a member of a team. And it does link back to some of the stuff of Gary Hamel about self-leadership. The next one I'm not going to dwell on because I've actually talked before on this at this conference, a really important piece of research working closely with AUA, and that's a whole thing about leadership, professional leadership and professional careers. And Celia Whitchurch looked at the relationship between professionals and academics, professional leaders and academics, and she is seeing a growing third collaborative space between people who have hybrid roles, which is driven by external agendas, driven by technology, and I think it is really important, and if you want to read about this again, you can see it on our website, but that whole area of let's break down that sense of academic and professional leaders. And some of you will know I banned a word in my organization 8 years ago. I found that people were being referred to as non-academics, i.e. you. No one, it's a human right, no one should be referred to by what they're not. And, we are professionals, so non-academics. I hope there's no university that uses non-academics. And then the next one is about alignment. And that is, again, a really problematic thing. Some of you will have seen, if you've heard me before this slide. I stick with it. Those two mice could be two academics. They could be two of you doing your job brilliantly in your department, in your box. There is a way through to the cheese. The cheese, by the way, is the strategy of the university. And what they're saying is, for me, it's more about a job well done in my bit and less about the cheese. And there was an endless issue. I was facilitating a senior management team the other day at a distinguished university. The debate was about how do we get the place more aligned? But not so aligned that it becomes corporate. A lot of these are conundrums, they're paradoxes, but they are critical issues on the agenda. The next one is we need to learn from other sectors, but please not just from the private sector. Because there are lots to learn from the private sector. Interestingly, 58% of finance directors are now from outside HE. A lot of them from the private sector. And that's, an interesting reflection on the dynamic. But I look at we run a program called Strategic Exchange. We take people into other places. John Lewis is a good example. I read an article in the Times Higher saying, we think universities should become like John Lewis. Lovely, you go into John Lewis, you have this kind of warm feeling, don't you? Or you go into the website, you just love it. Well, most people do. You feel you're loved, you feel everyone loves each other, etc. When we did that, we went to the top of John Lewis. I have to tell you, there are two things that are quite different for universities. Through the whole organization, there is an enormous sense of alignment. Much more than you will find in most universities. And at the top, you may think it's a soft and woolly organization. It's as tough as any about how it's run. But it's worth looking. Another piece of research we've done by Dr. Tom Kenny, who runs it's a stimulus paper, a short one, who runs our top management program, is on looking at professional services firms, corporate lawyers, but see what we can learn from those sectors. And indeed, we might well learn from the third sector. Entrepreneurs, and I did quote this last year, I think it's so crucial. There's an awful lot about the entrepreneurial university, and this is one of the gurus. She's still alive, I saw her a few years ago, Rosameth Moss Cantor. The Change Masters, one of the best books ever about change. And her description of entrepreneurs, that they measure themselves not by the standards of the past, how far they have come, but by the visions of the future, how far they have to go. And they do not allow the past to serve as a restraint on the future. And you've got to reflect on that, on the wider part of that quote, on your own institutions and the issues of how entrepreneurial you are. And then to sort of draw things together, really, this question of leadership, I've dealt with much of it already. There's sort of leadership qualities that are needed for this world. I've talked about the interpretative leader sitting on the boat again. Being entrepreneurial, being business focused, I think I've spelt focused wrong, and there may have been some other misprints in these slides you may have noticed. I think it's very important about building people's confidence. In a period of change and uncertainty, you can give people lots of competencies, but what they need is confidence to go forward. Balancing support with strong challenge. Being tough with people, I'm afraid, who don't get it. And I've, again, already mentioned this, offering a clear narrative and a point of sale. That sense of we do know where we're going, but we equally know the story of how to get there. Collaboration is important. And lastly, one of the most important things about leadership is to energize people, to give people that sense of energy and excitement and determination. And I do come across, I'm afraid, in quite a lot of universities, and I've been to 148 universities in the last 8 years, and many times, I find a lot of depressed people, of people who are feeling dismayed at selling out and betraying, a bit like Stefan Collini's book. The 10th one, I've got to magic. The Tempest. We are such stuff as dreams are made of. Now, Prospero was not a perfect leader at all. He was really quite a manipulative leader in the use of magic. But we use, and at least one person here, Alistair knows because he was at the event, we use on our programs mythodrama, which is led by Laurence Olivier's son, Richard Olivier, and we use the stories of Shakespeare brought alive by actors who understand leadership to think about the messages of Shakespeare to prompt us to reflect on leadership. And the most recent one they've got is actually, they're using, is on The Tempest. And it made me think about magic and leadership. And we can, as a Leadership Foundation, can teach all these principles. We can work with you in your institutions on all the sound principles of good leadership, good management, good governance, and we will get a long way with you. But I think the best leaders have all of that and a bit of magic dust. And you need to reflect on the leaders, and they could be people who, they might be people who are dead, people who you've worked with, who are working within your organization now, who have that little extra. A quote from Nelson Mandela, which just says it all. The history of the struggle in South Africa is rich with the stories of heroes and heroines. Some of them leaders, some of them followers. All of them deserve to be remembered. In other words, remember and celebrate the followers as much as the leaders. That is what I call an example of magic thinking. So what do I think magic is? I think it's about seeing new connections between things that you don't necessarily hit everyone, doesn't necessarily hit everyone. Transforming the obvious. I do believe that the wheel can be reinvented and should be reinvented many times. Crossing boundaries, going to John Lewis at the top, looking at other institutions, using humor, not just humor, but the structure of humor that reveals insights. But doing all this, not magic, which Prospero does in many ways, in a manipulative way, magic that is underpinned with trust and respect. These are important characteristics. And so, to conclude, I want to go right back 8 years to this was when we did one of our first reports, the Times Higher. You know, he lands from Mars and take me to your leader. Well, we don't have a leader to take you to. 8 years on, and certainly by the time I retire, I want to have banned that perception from every university, and I would hope every one of your universities, if the man or woman arrives from Mars, there'll be a clear understanding as to who to take them to. And lastly, again, a leader who has magic for me often it said, what are universities for? Why are we doing this? Why are we here? And I used to run the Civil Service College, and I was asked to produce a quote to put on a millennium statue we created. And I took the one from Mahatma Gandhi. Live as though you might die tomorrow, i.e. today you live for the moment. Learn as though you will live forever. And that is, in many ways, the business that we're in, the business of, clearly we're in the business of learning, but it is for life, it is forever, and that, I think, is, again, an example of the quote that is magic. So, there we are. I hope that's inspired you to think, and thank you very much indeed. Right, will anyone dare answer the question on magic? Someone venture to say something that they've seen which they regard as magic in a leader.
Hi, I'm Jo Edwards from the University of Strathclyde. This isn't a Strathclyde experience, so it will remain anonymous. But I have had a manager in the past who I think was a fantastic leader, and it was exactly that trust that you were talking about. He trusted everyone he worked with to do a great job, and he was encouraging and supportive. And I think that makes all the difference. So you can have all the other qualities, you know, you can have a clear vision, you can be charismatic, you can carry people along with you, but I think unless that trust and encouragement and support is there, then you're lacking that magic.
Thank you. Thank you for that inspirational speech. I think there's an awful lot in there that we can take away. I'm not thinking of any specific leader, but it does occur to me that we need different leaders for different times, and that the kind of leaders that work well in periods of change, in times of war, if you like, are not the same as the leaders that are best in times of peace. And I can think of one or two colleagues that I've worked for that have been very right for the time.
You raise a very interesting point for our sector at the moment, because you can make an argument in certain institutions, facing certain governments, as, you know, that we are in a state of war, so to speak. I think it's very dangerous, though, to flip into that. I mean, what it really means is more top-down, you know, more dirigiste, because people will accept it at times of war. But actually, running a university, despite some of your views, is not about fighting the Third World War. Hope it isn't. And I think one has to tread with great care. On the other hand, sometimes you just have to do it. And sometimes I would say to a leader who's hovering and havering and uncertain, look, if that's what you've got to do, and people, your followers, will acknowledge it and respect it, so long as the evidence is clear that you've got to be more dirigiste. I'm now inviting other comments about magic, or questions generally. Any so questions?
Mine is a comment about a leader, and it's one I'll name, actually. Maxwell Irvine, who died this week.
Yeah.
And he was at Aberdeen, where I am, and he had what I call the common touch. He never forgot that once he was a junior person, and he treated every member of staff with care and respect. Yeah. And that was a great leader.
And respect is a critical part of the psychological contract. Things can change within it, things are changing in it, but as the respect thing goes, and we're a very interesting sector. I mean, just the whole discourse, the academic discourse, is one of brutal challenge. It always interested me, coming from outside higher education, there was probably more evidence of bullying in this sector than many other sectors I'd worked in. Respect is very important.
I'm Issa Shehu from the National Open University of Nigeria. Leadership actually is a key word in any setup, but I realize in most of the African universities, we are still using the word academic staff and non-academic staff. So now what do we then call the non-academic staff in an organizational setup like this?
Well, we tend, I mean, your point is a very valid one. and don't think it's just in your country that we still have non-academics. But I tend to use professional services staff, professional and support staff. It's difficult to get precise to the right term. And of course, there is a conundrum here, because many academics will say we are professional. Our profession is being an academic. But that doesn't matter. I think that most, huge numbers of people in the kind of roles that are in AUA, in fact, not all of you, would see yourself in some kind of professional role. So I tend to take professional services, professional support as the best kind of form of words.
Hello, Rachel Birds, University of Sheffield. I was interested in the concept that you raised about disruptive innovation, and you talked quite a lot about entrepreneurial approaches as well. And it reminded me of an article that I read recently about the concept of the entrepreneurial manager. So for Chakravarthy and Lorange, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but for those in the room that perhaps aren't, what these authors are arguing is that embedded in large organisations and sympathetic to its values, being a vital part of the community, if you like, that these managers are able to bring about change locally through challenging and being able to get things done because they know the processes, they know the people. And I think probably being such an entrepreneurial manager might be something that a lot of people in this room would aspire to. And I wondered, therefore, how far you thought that notion might contribute to protecting the psychological contract.
I think it will. I think I keep on coming back to collaboration. And I'm thinking of another management guru. Many of you will know of John Cotter's 8 Steps of Managing Change. And the most important of those is change only happens if there is what he calls a guiding coalition, which is a number of people across an institution or organization. And I think that what doesn't work is one really entrepreneurial person or one fantastic entrepreneurial vice-chancellor who comes and then hopes the whole culture will change. The evidence of not of change theory is that really effective change happens because there are a number of people in different parts of the organization and at various levels, not just at the top table, who, in a sense, set a kind of bushfires going that then join up in the organization. That's how entrepreneurial leadership works. And back to Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, she came, I said, to the UK about 3 years ago, and she gave the most amazing speech about innovation, same linked issue. And she said, addressing a wide audience, innovation is only and only a collaborative activity. The idea of one person sitting up in a garret sorting out the answer, or one really powerful member of the senior management team, or the chair of the governing body, it won't work. It is so collaborative entrepreneurialism is the way you get the energy moving for change, I think, particularly in a university.
Thank you. I think, colleagues, that's a fantastic note to end on, because in terms of collaboration, it tells us that we all have to do something to make change happen within our institutions. Please join with me in giving a big thank you to Ewart.